So in effect, the trend has helped to shrink the availability and access to affordable housing for low-income populations. Financialization has also become a crucial driver of land grab perpetrated against highly impoverished populations who are routinely displaced by the government and powerful corporate actors in the country, justified often in the name of clearing illegal settlements or advancing the new euphemism of private-public partnerships for development. All of this in complete disregard of the due process of law, certainly of land and housing rights of the victims. Financialization is also very intricately wed with increased investments in housing as a new safe haven for hiding corrupt money by officials and agents as international money laundering schemes have become a risky affair globally. And this is one of the explanations for the millions of housing units you have around Nigeria's major cities in Lagos. Anyone who has been in Lagos, if you know of the Lekki corridor, is littered with millions of housing units that no one lives in, even when more than 2/3 of the population live within some of the poorest neighborhoods, that lack services. Now the net result is a staggering housing deficit of nearly 20 million, of which Lagos alone as a city, as you know, nearly 20 million people accounts for more than 6.5% of this deficit. Whereas the rest of the population live in more than 100 informal settlements that are scattered around the city. Now within this context, the right to adequate housing has become completely lost in translation. Nobody really cares because the government doesn't even see or realize its fundamental obligation to guarantee the right to adequate housing and to ensure that everyone has access to a place to live.
Great, thank you, Felix. Guadalupe, can you tell us how you see this issue from your perspective and coming from Argentina?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Chris. So, as you may know, Latin America is one of the most unequal regions in the world, and wealth. Oh, okay. See, no. Yeah. Well, if anything, you could check this later. I'm going to explain it. So, the thing is, wealth has historically been deeply linked to land ownership. What is the current situation in this moment? Basically, the market is unregulated, so it sets the rule. The economic growth that many of the southern countries in Latin America had faced by the turning of the 21st century provoked a massive flow of capital from different productive sectors, both legal and illegal, into the real estate market, mainly on sumptuous residential developments. These market dynamics have accelerated the land prices up, and this affected the two other ways of access to housing in Latin America, that is through the social production of habitat and through public housing. This had two main consequences in terms of right to housing, that is the growth of inequality, territorial inequality, and the concentration of property. Regarding territorial inequality, it has deepened the social-spatial segregation. 1 out of 10 persons in Argentina lives in a slum, while in 2016, in cities like Buenos Aires, half of the production of residential housing was sumptuous. It also forced urban and rural displacement due to the extractivist pattern like agribusiness, mega mining, neoliberal urbanism. It also relegated public housing to where the land is cheaper, that is, to the peripheries. I mean, we see massive production of houses without city. In terms of concentration of property, the main manifestations relate to the difficulty in the access to affordable housing, such as the growth in the renting housing sector. For example, in Buenos Aires, in the last 10 years, it has grown from a 22% to a 30%. I mean, we do have a major, and we have a word in Spanish for that, that is inquilinización we also created a word to explain this phenomena, that is the growing renting sector. Another thing is expansion of the speculative sector. Something was mentioned, short-term rentals that are aggravating gentrification, typologies that are unlivable, such as the micro-apartments, and obviously vacant homes. In Buenos Aires, 20% of the properties are unused, are subutilized, so this is a major problem. And finally, obviously, homelessness. We have seen many land occupations in the last years due to this expansive market. Mariam Al-Kawaya said in the plenary session on Monday that you wouldn't like to live in a country where human activists were sent to jail, were put in prison. The picture I would like to see you when you see the presentation, it's a massive manifestation in Plaza de Mayo a few days ago, because in Latin America, activists who fight for housing and land are being killed. So you wouldn't like to live in a country where they are actually murdered. So what I mean with this is this person was killed for defending the Patagonia land from the Benetton Imperium. The violations are wide ranges in Argentina and Latin America, but the right remains the same, a place to live. I leave it there.
Great, thank you. So, Anthony, to you now, and thanks to all the panelists for being relatively quick. Anthony, you have 2 minutes to give us your perspective on this crisis.
Thank you, Chris. I'll try to be short, but the less you know, the more time you need to explain it. So, I'm happy to be here today. I'm impressed to see so many people in the room this early in the morning in LA. I've done a lot of meetings in New England, and I was highly skeptical that they were going to organize a meeting for 9 o'clock. So really, this is a popular topic. I'll preface my comments by saying I'm not a specialist on real estate, so I find this conversation really interesting. I do work very closely with the financial community, with stock exchanges, large institutional investors, asset managers, pension funds, these sort of organizations. So I have some understanding from the finance situation. I think that the whole title of the session, Financialization of Real Estate, I think for me, I think there maybe should be a little bit more clarification about what we're talking about. I mean, all real estate is financialized, even if it's public housing for poor people. You have to finance that somehow, that's through government bonds or taxes, what have you. And I think it maybe obfuscates the issue a little bit. If we think about investors investing in real estate, I think, again, we should put that into context. The largest investors in the world by a very wide margin are pension funds and sovereign wealth funds. The California State Employees Pension Fund alone manages $300 billion. It's the largest public pension fund in the United States. The Norwegian State Sovereign Wealth Fund, they are the largest fund in the world. They own roughly 1% of every company on the planet. These are the very large funds, and I can tell you what they invest in. Overwhelmingly, they're investing in debt, and if you break down the types of debt they own, that's overwhelmingly government debt, so government bonds. Secondary types of debt would be corporate debt. There might be some more exotic products in there. We heard earlier about the problem with the asset-backed securities in the United States. That was obviously led to the last financial crisis. That was a huge problem, and there were a lot of pension funds invested in that, but they were receiving these products after they had filtered through a very long financial chain and been certified as AAA credit-rated products by people like Moody's and so on, which raises, I think, very big questions about the rating agencies, why they were rating these that way. But the original problems lied with the actual banks handing out mortgages to people who could not afford the mortgages, or handing out mortgages that had these kind of explosive growth in interest rates in year 2 or 3, so they were kind of deceptive lending practices. So just to put that into that context, that the biggest institutional investors in the world, their biggest thing is going into government bonds. The second biggest thing they're investing in is equity in corporations, so that's just all the big companies around the world, they're buying their stock. The smallest sliver that they would be investing in might be things like real estate. And that's not to diminish what's being said here, because it's something that we have seen earlier in this space. A couple of years ago, there was a very big discussion around food prices and commodity food prices. And what had happened there, and I think this relates to this conversation, is that some asset managers had started to take the attitude that food was now an asset class, and that if you diversify your portfolio into different asset classes, part of your asset class should include basic food commodities like corn, soybeans, whatever. If you have an extremely large pension fund shift even 1% of its assets or 0.5% of its assets into products around agricultural issues like food, that becomes a very serious thing that can influence the prices in the market. Food things like corn, soybeans, futures contracts, to understand those really, they are like an insurance product. And it's a totally legitimate product to buy if you are in the agricultural industry. You're buying an insurance product against crop failure or something like that. It's a highly questionable product to buy if you're not in the food industry. Now it's like me buying life insurance on any one of you people. Why? I don't know you. That would be weird. You should not be buying crop insurance if you're not in the agricultural industry. And so there's deep questions about non-agricultural entities investing in crop futures contracts. So in the same way, and I think the issue this panel is addressing is if you have asset managers who have been persuaded that real estate is now an asset class that they should go into, and they're constructing vehicles for that kind of investment, even a very small sliver of large funds can shift market prices. So that is one thing. I know I have 2 minutes, so I'll just close. But the other thing I want to mention is that a big player in this space are high net worth individuals. And that is even though the vast majority of the money in this world is run by pension funds, we cannot underestimate the influence of high net worth individuals. We live in an era of uber wealth. I mean, if you look at the Rockefellers and so on of 100 years ago, they do not compare with the wealthy people today in terms of the magnitude of their wealth and what they can buy. And these people in particular are buying up real estate all over the world as simply a store of value.
Thank you, Anthony. Great. So we've now finished with the first round of questions. We're a little behind time, and I want to give space to the audience, so I'm going to ask our panelists to be even sharper on this second round, which is going to be tough because I have 2 questions for you. First, we want to talk about what remedies are being applied to this issue by states, private actors, NGOs, in order to protect the rights of vulnerable groups affected by the financialization of housing. That's question 1. And are these remedies commensurate with states' obligations under international human rights law and under the guiding principles for business and human rights? So what are the remedies that we're seeing, and are they actually consistent with human rights? And you have 4.5 minutes for this one. I'm shaving 30 seconds because we're a little behind. And I'm going to start here with Guadalupe.
Okay. Thank you, Chris. So I'm going to talk a little about remedies and anti-remedies. Latin America has many expressions of remedies. I am interested particularly in 3. The first one is community planning. There is a case I really like, that is the community of Vila Autódromo in Rio de Janeiro, that has faced 9 attempts of evictions in a very few years. That is 9 attempts. The last of which was the excuse, the construction of a highway that was going to go across the community due to the Olympic Games in 2016. So what they do, they join universities and committed professionals, and they took the urban planning in their hands and developed a community plan that proved that the eviction was not only necessary, that was not necessary, but also that they had a very good strategy to remain there, and it was also cheaper than the dislocation the government was proposing. So such experiences in community planning are not profuse in Latin America, but when they do happen, they have a lot of significance, because not only they are technical tools that prove other ways of urban planning and housing, but they also empower communities against governments that are provoking forced evictions. The second remedy is the cooperative housing production. There are many. In this case, yes, there are many expressions all around Latin America of unions of workers who have taken into their own hands the production of housing. So the aim of this is to solve the access of the most vulnerable sectors. And it's a huge grassroots initiative that literally definancializes the housing. The design and the construction of the housing is literally produced for and by the people in order to have a place to live. Finally, the third one is what I call the legislative activism. We have two very beautiful examples in Latin America. One is the Fórum Nacional de Reforma Urbana in Brazil that had advocated for a constitutional reform in the 80s that allowed one of the most progressive laws in Latin America, that is the city statute. Habitar Argentina took this experience and also developed a very similar law at a provincial level in Buenos Aires. And they also created the National Consensus for a Dignified Habitat that establishes 10 points, 10 guidelines for governments to implement urban policy. So these movements are the ones who are pushing the political and legislative agenda in terms of right to housing, and they are actually conquering in terms of right to housing new goals. So the thing is, most remedies in Latin America these days are emerging from grassroots movements. That is, they constitute a huge effort towards ensuring right to housing, but they do not have the proper scale as long as government initiatives are going the other way. So the positive impact of these remedies is somehow mitigated by the anti-remedies the governments are implementing. So I may go through some examples in the three areas where the right to housing should be developed, that is, respect, protect, and fulfill. In terms of respect, forced eviction are an ongoing process all around Latin America. This is a huge problem. Excuses posed by the governments to displace local populations normally respond to the need of incorporating new land into the urban markets. That's basically it. No matter if the excuse is environmental or construction of anything, I mean, all in all, what they are meaning is you have to leave this place because now it's a land that has a good price for the market. So what we see more and more are that these evictions are being violent. This is the picture you should see after this and remind what I'm saying, is a door that has been painted as a graffiti by the local government in Rio de Janeiro. So what they do is with the people actually living still in their homes, they paint it with a graffiti with a D that stands for demolish and a date that says the date that house is going to be evicted and demolished with the people inside. The second issue about protecting is that maybe urbanization of informal settlements is probably one of the biggest challenges in the region nowadays. Many governments around LATAM have been dealing with these issues for the last years. Nevertheless, to urbanize without any market regulations, it's only forcing more gentrification and displacements. So this is severely affecting the right to adequate housing and to affordable housing. Finally, in terms of fulfilling the right to housing, it's quite difficult to fulfill it when we have national governments, such as the Argentinian, that in 2016 promoted a whitewash bill that enabled massive flows of capital, illegal capital, into the real estate market. That is what explained basically the jump into the residential housing in 2016. I mean, those massive flows into Argentina by this whitewash bill launched by the government. And last week, they announced they are willing to pass a law that implements mortgage bonds, such as the ones who involved in the subprime crisis of 2008. So we have good remedies in Latin America that lack scale. And on the other hand, we have aggravators that might have a massive negative impact on the right to housing. So the challenge remains the same, and my final picture is also graffiti, that is, not people without houses, nor houses without people.
Thank you, Guadalupe. Okay, Felix, you're up now with some examples from Nigeria. Remedies and connection between countries.
Just to put it out there, in Nigeria, we do not have anything that is close to a comprehensive housing strategy. It doesn't exist. In many of our big cities like Lagos, we also do not have anything that resembles a city development strategy. And the government has been very unwilling to engage in any form of programs on land regularization that would extend security of tenant to millions of those who live in Nigeria's many informal settlements. Who are often targeted, as Guadalupe was saying, by programs of forced eviction. Over the last 20 years, we've had more than 5-6 million people evicted from their homes without any kind of remedy. And legal remedy in Nigeria is also very difficult and inaccessible because constitutionally, the right of good housing is made non-justiciable. So, you go to court, which is already difficult to access, you're told that these are not rights that can be enforced. Even though with lots of creative lawyering, we've managed to get the courts to take certain positions that have been very helpful to people. You also have remedies that come from extreme pressure imposed by non-governmental organizations. Just to give a couple of examples, in 2014, CERAC was involved in using the inspection panel of the World Bank to challenge a massive forced eviction of the Badia community in Lagos that was host to this project that was supposed to benefit from the use of this loan money and to provide basic services to populations. But instead, the government turned around to fund their displacement with the money obtained from the bank. And with CERAC's intervention, we were able to get the inspection panel to compel the government of Nigeria to provide some compensation to those who were displaced in that instance. Another good example that comes from Nigeria is what's going on with the Lekki Free Trade Zone. In 2007, the Lagos State government, in partnership with a large Chinese consortium, began the construction of what is turned out to be probably the largest industrial complex on the continent in the Lekki corridor. Again, the government did so without reference to the communities that own the land that was taken, over 7,500 hectares of land taken for this massive project. Again, it took the intervention of CERAC to again force the government to the table, and over a 6-month period, negotiated what is now called the Lekki Coastal MOU, which again symbolically granted about 2.5% of the equity shares of the government's holding in the Lekki Free Trade Zone to the host communities, as well as about 10% of the land that was taken from them as resettlement land to the people. But what is significant is that nearly 10 years on, many of the agreements that were reached in the MOU have yet to be implemented. Meanwhile, the project itself is on a full throttle. Now, Dangote, one of Africa's biggest investors, is building a massive refinery within the trade zone. There's a seaport that's been constructed in the zone as well as an airport. So it's a huge undertaking. Whereas those little people whose land was taken for this project are still out in the cold. Even the IFC is participating in financing some of the projects within the zone, but no one is seriously asking what has happened with the landowners who have been displaced from their farmlands. And of course, not to speak about the impact on livelihoods of these farmers who now in 10 years have not had access to any place to farm and feed their families. I can go on and on with examples of interventions that have been promoted by non-governmental intervention, but as far as the formal state is concerned, there's a huge disconnect in their understanding of their responsibility. All they care about is the investment and do not care at all about the corresponding obligations to ensure that these investments are organized in a way that is beneficial as well as respects basic norms of human rights.
Perfect. Thank you, Felix. Anthony, what can you tell us about from your slightly different perspective with respect to these two questions.
Yeah, I can speak from some remedies from a purely finance perspective, keeping in mind that obviously in different contexts, if there's not the political institutions in place to enforce these or political will, then, okay, it sounds nice, but so what? I mean, the most obvious control on the using real estate as an asset class to be traded is public housing. And that is, if you look at, we talk about urbanization, one of the greatest examples I always use is Singapore, because the entire country is just one city. So they take urbanization very seriously. About half the population of Singapore lives in public housing. So public housing is very serious there. So public housing is the most obvious thing. You introducing things that simply cannot be traded on the market, that cannot be bought and sold by private investors. It's an obvious solution, but of course it requires a lot of political will, as well as government finances to pay for it. So again, Singapore is a very wealthy country. A lot of wealthy countries have public financing, public housing programs. What do you do in developing countries? I mean, if we look at a city like Lagos or Bombay or what have you, where are these housings coming from? Where is this housing coming from, and who's paying for it? The other controls you can put in place, things like what led to the financial crisis in the United States, what's the use of mortgage-backed securities or collateralized debt obligations. You can simply stop using these things. The market may seem like the Wild West, but in fact it's highly regulated. You cannot simply trade any product. Products have to be approved much in the same way that drugs have to be approved. So you can, securities regulators can simply intervene and say that product is not suitable for trading. And they do this all the time. In the news, you often hear about Bitcoin, which has now soared to $10,000. But that's something that's not traded on U.S. markets, not in a regulated way on the open market. And that's because security regulators don't allow it. So, it is possible to not allow trading of something. The final thing I would say is, and this applies more to high net worth individuals driving up prices, is fiscal controls. Particularly, this applies to buying homes, collecting homes. You see this in a lot of countries, the country we're in right here, Switzerland, many other countries. The tax rate you pay on buying a home starts to expand exponentially based on whether it's your first home, second home, third home, etc. So, but if you're in the process of collecting a portfolio of 20 or 30 homes, it starts to become economically unviable at a certain point. So that is possible, but again, that requires public will and so on. The final thing I'd mention, which is maybe, it's not a specific control in the finance sector, but I just want to throw it out there, which is that we talk about lack of housing, it is linked to urbanization, and urbanization is again linked to jobs. So the question is really, are the houses where the jobs are? And so another part of this is industrial policy and trying to create jobs where the people are and where the housing is. Because it's not the case that all real estate is exorbitantly expensive everywhere. If you go to rural areas in a lot of places, I'm sure I could find very cheap land in Nigeria somewhere, but I wouldn't find a job there. And particularly if I'm a farmer, maybe it's not good farmland. So there's a reason it's cheap. But you can change the value of land through industrial policies and so on. But this is a much bigger program, again, requiring a lot of political will and concentration, but just to throw that out there. One last thing I'd just say is that in your engagement on this issue, I mean, I can see that a lot of engagement is targeted at public sector entities. To the extent that it would be helpful, you can also engage directly with investors, large institutional investors. They are open to hearing concerns. Many times they can influence markets, as I mentioned before, with food commodities, and they're totally unaware of it. They have no idea what they're doing. Because for them, it's a tiny part of their portfolio, and they have no idea that it's having an impact on someone else. So it is possible to have a conversation with you.
Great. Thanks very much for that, Anthony. And now, Leilani, you know the two questions.
Thanks. I'm actually going to begin by not answering either of the two questions. We've been having discussions over the last few days about whether I obey rules well And I think the decision was I don't. I want to just take up Anthony's question about definition, because maybe we should have been very clear. My report is very clear about what I mean by the financialization of housing. And for me, it means the structural changes in housing and financial markets and global investment, where housing is treated as a commodity, a means of accumulating wealth and security for financial instruments, where housing is used as a security for financial instruments. And Anthony's quite right. In some ways, this isn't that new. But what's new, and Anthony pointed to it, is the uber amounts of wealth that are now being sunk into housing. Residential real estate is valued at $160 trillion. Residential real estate, $160 trillion. That's more than twice the total amount of total GDP of every country in the world, times 2. More than times 2. So it's a huge amount that's being sunk into residential real estate. And from my perspective, even if it isn't where pension funds are investing huge amounts of money, what makes this a very particular and unique, or somewhat unique area, is that housing is a human right. And so it's different than gold. If they're investing in gold, okay, go invest in gold. That may have labor repercussions or ramifications, for example, but gold itself is not a human right, whereas housing, the asset, is a human right. And so that's where the tension comes, and that's where my report comes from. So I just wanted to put that on the table. And while, it may be that pension funds have $300 billion that they're investing, Goldman Sachs has a portfolio of $35 billion that they're, allocating to real estate. And at one point, Blackstone, which is the largest private equity firm, that's also the largest landlord in the U.S. of single-family homes. They bought up all that bad debt, and then from homeowners, they took away the homes from homeowners who couldn't pay their debt, and are now renting back to those homeowners. And they were spending at one point, I think it was $150 million per week on homes. So it may not be the whole portfolio of a pension fund, but it's huge dollars we're talking about, and it's those dollars up against the little person, right? I mean, the everyday person who's just trying to make ends meet. So that, for me, is the human rights dimension here that I'm trying to get at. Now I'll answer the question. In my report, I had the opportunity to try to do some global research. Who's doing what? And I did find some really interesting stuff happening in what I would call a piecemeal kind of way. And a lot of it is through tax incentives or tax, whatever you call that, a stick. I found in different countries restrictions on foreign purchases in a variety of countries, vacant home taxes, property sales taxes, where that tax money might actually be fed. This happens in Singapore, for example. It's a high tax rate, 18% tax on luxury properties, and that tax goes directly back into the provision of affordable home ownership. Property speculation taxes, capital gains taxes, increased taxes. This is in China, for example. If you flip, so if you sell your home, you buy a property and then you sell it within 1 year, you have a higher tax rate. If you sell it within 2 years, still a higher tax rate. So the idea is trying to prevent flipping from happening. A lot of the measures, the monies that accrue from the taxes don't flow back into the housing sector necessarily. And so that was one critique I had of those policies. But I have a bigger critique, which is I'm just not sure that these kind of piecemeal regulations are enough, given what we're up against here, given the model that's being used. They don't really challenge the model. And I mean, I'd like to hear more from all of you about whether you think we're stuck with this model, or whether there are changes to the model that could we actually start looking at housing as something other than a commodity? And I mean, housing as a commodity, a lot of people view it that way. It's not just the high net worth individuals, for example. It's not just the Blackstones and the Goldman Sachs. I mean, I live in North America, and I mean, dinner conversation. What is dinner conversation these days? Oh, I mean, I live in Canada, so Vancouver's a hot market, Toronto's a hot market. What's dinner conversation? It is, I just found out my property has tripled in value in the last 5 years. I just got my property tax assessment, and it's saying that my property is worth, that is... I was at the hairdresser the other day, and she said that she cannot stand it anymore. Every single person who sits in her seat talks about how wealthy they're becoming through their ownership of property. So the question is, can we change that model? And then for me, the question is, as the special rapporteur in my very privileged position, working on the global stage and having access to states and to subnational governments, is there a different conversation that we need to be having? Is there a new conversation that we need to be having? And that's part of the purpose of this panel, was to try to suggest that maybe at the global level, we do need to be having this conversation. And maybe we need to bring in the private sector. And I don't know whether we have the private sector here, if we have any high net worth individuals in the room. You can self-disclose, or anyone representing a private equity firm would be really interesting. I agree with Anthony that those are the conversations we need to have. I have been knocking on the door of Blackstone, who have invited me in but not set a date. So I believe that the way we're going to make change is through these sorts of conversations. What my question is at the global level, where should the conversation be happening? Is it here at the Business and Human Rights Forum? I went to UNECE, they have a housing, land, property forum. I went there. Is it there that I should be having it? Where should the conversation sit? Such that it's meaningful and leads to meaningful and good outcomes from a human rights point of view. I'm interested in and I think there are some people in the room who know about this new treaty or I don't know what it's being called. Is it a convention? Convention? Treaty on business and human rights. Is that the forum where this might come up? So I leave my comments there.
Okay, great. Well, thanks to all the panelists for being succinct, and that leaves plenty of space now for a robust discussion with all of you. You've heard some thoughts from the panel, and now we'd like to get your own insights or questions. Great, I'm going to take about 3 comments or questions, and then we'll move from there, and I think we'll get a couple rounds in. Let's have this gentleman over here first.
My name is Ali Aouni. I'm with the American University in Cairo. Now, when you talk about the housing, I'm talking about Egypt, per se. The big part of the issue is actually the middle class, and you cannot blame them. Housing remains a safe, housing or land remains a safe, risk-free investment. This is one. Second, if I'm looking for housing, I mean, in 10 years, apartments would actually probably double in price. So I'm not investing in an apartment just because of financialization or anything like that. It's more of what the gentleman said. There is no other alternative for viable investment for me. I mean, I'd rather put my investment in something that is more productive, that brings value for me. Now, add to this, there is a tremendous legacy of terrible policy and rules, because we were borderline socialist and now we were borderline capitalist. So the rules are terrible. It does not provide me with, as a landowner, to sort of rent my apartment. So there are all sort of that kind of a thing. And we're talking about middle class, failing economies. Now this is one. Now the other thing, we talk about public housing. I mean, come on. I mean, I'm talking about Egypt, even in the US. I mean, when the government gets, or the municipalities get into owning land, owning apartments and renting, there is an issue of allocation first, and there are lots of bias there are lots of corruption. There is also an issue of, I have an apartment, I build it, Now, 20 years later, it needs to be rehabilitated or maintained. And there are lots of issues. I mean, in the UK, for example, recently there was a fire in a whole apartment just because it was old. So it's not failing. I mean, it is failing. I mean, in some aspect, the only places where you find this working is probably things like places like Singapore or Hong Kong. And you could argue because it's a small community and it's affluent to start with. So what is the solution? I mean, for me, it's a little bit, and I don't see public housing as a solution. And I see you have to play with the economics. I mean, you cannot just say that I'm going to go on the side and I'm going to play a different game. No, you have to play the same game, but it has to be community-based somehow. And this is just my comment. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I think I saw another hint. Yes, the woman against the wall.
Thank you very much, all the panelists. My name is Misa, and I'm from Asia Pacific Forum on Women, Law, and Development. We're a feminist network in Asia Pacific. There's so much of land grabbing and resource grabbing happening in Asia Pacific that directly links to people's right to housing, but I just want to draw a little bit more of attention to the trade and investment agreements, whether it be bilateral or mega trade agreements that is happening right now, because surprisingly enough, very recently, the government of South Korea received an intent saying that there will be possibly investor-state dispute settlement mechanism, the case filed against the South Korea government because a foreign investor bought a piece of land that's attached to a house, private property, and then the city of South Korea government purchased it for the redevelopment of the city areas. And then that investor is going to sue the South Korean government. So I think we're looking at a very different picture in the power structure here. It's not about the national policies, but how do we challenge that more macro level powerful structure that actually make each sovereign state incapable of putting any public policies, and whether it is through the guiding principles or whether the new binding treaty conversation may change the structure. So I just want to draw some insights from you how to tackle that and then regain the power of the people to make decisions over our own land and what could look like to have a right to have adequate housing. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Let's take this woman here.
Good morning. My name is Maria. I work at a Brazilian NGO called Terra dos Direitos, and I also integrate Fórum Nacional de Reforma Urbana. My question is concerning the crisis, the financialization, and considering that in Brazil, for instance, the housing shortage we have is basically the problem that Guadalupe mentioned as inquilinos, so people who can't access loan with excessive rental rates, and it's not a cohabitation anymore. And we believe perhaps social rent we have built a program for homeless people, and it basically it would be providing social rent, and in two models. One of them would be in public parks, so public housing, but in model of social rent, so you wouldn't acquire the house, and the other one would be with a private sector, so you could offer a unit, an apartment for the homeless people and temporarily. And this is because if we can build a program for homeless people who cannot access regular products, and considering that in Brazil, for instance, public housing is only the production, we don't have a social rent program. If you cannot contract a loan, if you cannot access credit, you cannot access housing. So housing is not seen as a public policy. It's not seen as a human right. So we have to shift from public housing. We have to see housing as a human right and to see it as an obligation of the government. If we can see that, and if we can include homeless people who basically share a group of other vulnerabilities and who cannot access credit, and therefore cannot be benefited in this model of production of public housing, then it means that we can perhaps advance. Because if you take elders, for instance, and other groups, if they cannot access credit, they cannot access housing. And the government does not see it as a right, as an obligation. This is why they only finance the production. And social rent, you invert the logic, and you take these people, and they do not necessarily have to be included in the financial system to access housing. And you take the state and its obligation. So it might be one shift into seeing housing as a public policy.
Great. So those are three great interventions. I could take one more. This gentleman here.
Yes, we sort of following up on that. So I'm the Chief Human Rights Commissioner of New Zealand. And just a couple of observations. First on Singapore. Singapore was desperately poor when its Prime Minister in 1959 said, we are going to be a property-owning democracy and we will be wealthier, healthier and better educated and more socially cohesive as a result. And by 1993, over 90% of Singaporeans own their own home. So your financial state, if your state takes housing seriously, is no barrier at all. In the meantime, in New Zealand, we went backwards. And Singaporeans are better educated, more healthy, more socially cohesive, better housed than New Zealanders. Because no one knew that there was a human right to housing. I was a capital markets lawyer for the first 10 years of my life. I'm sure you never came up in that context. I was in New Zealand's largest and a multinational building materials manufacturer for the next 10 years of my life. It never came up in that context. And as a human rights commissioner coming into the job, I didn't know about the right to adequate housing. And the Commission had no priority on the right to adequate housing, despite the fact that we had a major earthquake which had destroyed thousands of houses, and no one was thinking of it in that way. So there's a couple of key things. Do not underestimate the ignorance of the right to adequate housing. Also, the language does matter. We've now begun to talk about the home much more than the house, which seems to resonate with people. I think we're fortunate that the incoming government is going to develop a 30-year housing strategy based on General Comment 4 of the CESC, using this year and across all the continuum of housing. So it's going to be very interesting to see how that works. But the ignorance is profound, and I think it's great work that Leilani is doing to get it out there. But the solutions ultimately are local. We don't need another treaty. We've had 4 treaties that New Zealand's ratified since that contain the right to housing, 2 declarations under an Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and the states around the world have done nothing. Signing treaties in Geneva does nothing. It's what locally matters.
Great. Thank you both for those encouraging and somewhat depressing thoughts, but very realistic. And what I like about that last comment is really the connection to human rights, and that's what this panel really should be diving into, because in addition to exploring this issue, and for me that's been edifying for sure, we are trying to think about what's the relevance of human rights to this issue. Where can we get any traction at all, given the sort of challenges with treaties, and is language really that relevant or not? I think the right to housing over the last 20, 25 years has gotten some traction on some of the more extreme issues, but there may even be cases like the one you just suggested of New Zealand actually using the right to housing as part of its policy elaboration, which would be remarkable. So I hope the panelists now, in thinking about the questions they just heard, don't respond only to the problem, but also think about where are human rights and the whole business and human rights framework as well, where are they relevant to this issue? Okay, now I'm going to turn it over to you. You had 4 comments / questions. You can pick and choose from those. I'm going to try to keep you still to 2 or 3 minutes each. You don't have to answer this first round. We're going to get another round of questions out there. So let's start with Leilani and then move to others.
Darn it. I was hoping you would not start with me because I haven't collected all my thoughts. let me start at the end and maybe work a little bit to the beginning. The ignorance issue, absolutely, and that's certainly one of the roles that I play as Special Rapporteur, is trying to really dispel myths as much as dispel ignorance. There's this idea that the right to housing means everyone, that the state must provide everyone with a home immediately. And of course, the right to adequate housing is a progressively realized right. There are some immediate obligations, obviously, where there are life and death matters in particular, like homelessness. And there are immediate obligations around non-discrimination and equality. But generally, it's understood that housing has to be realized progressively, or the right to housing has to be realized progressively. That education piece is so difficult, but it can be done. If I might, I have had the opportunity to work with my own country where I live, and they just adopted a rights-based national housing strategy. It is by no means perfect, but it is a step toward what we're talking about, where they will eventually have to grapple. They didn't in the strategy yet, but they'll have to connect the dots between what we're talking about today, financialization, and what they put in their strategy, which is more about social housing, public housing, rental supplements and things like that. That's where I'm finding a huge disconnect. So we're talking about financialization, commodification of housing. And yet when I talk to governments or states about housing strategies, they want to talk to me about only public housing or homelessness. And I'm saying, yes, but I also want to talk about the financial end of this. I want to talk about the economics here. Even though I'm a human rights lawyer and I know nothing about economics, I know human rights and I know there's an interaction. And that, to merge those conversations, it seems to me almost impossible. And it goes to Maria's point as well. So I think there's a lot of work to be done. I do find a responsiveness, though. Now, maybe it's because I'm a rapporteur and they're not going to say, like, screw off or whatever. But I find, I think states and cities in particular are troubled. And I think the SDGs and the new urban agenda are a sign that states are recognizing, and subnational governments, mayors are really recognizing, we are on an unsustainable path. And so that provides that window of, the opportunity to have the conversation. If we may not agree, but at least there's a sense that something's not right. I mean, urbanization at the pace that it's happening and the fallout with respect to housing, everyone seems to agree it's a problem. So that provides the opening for those conversations. To the person who talked about trade and investment agreements, I did a little bit of research for my report on that and discovered very much what you were talking about. I mean, all those the dispute mechanisms favor investors. I report on a few cases that I found where a state is saying, we don't want this luxury development to go ahead, this luxury housing development to go ahead, because we have our own housing policy that we're trying to implement on this piece of land, and the state gets completely dinged, has to make huge, massive payments to the developer. In one case in Mauritius, it was the UK. It was a UK developer, and Mauritius ended up having to pay a lot, and no discussion of human rights at all. So if there were a way in those dispute mechanisms to start having human rights conversations and say, well, wait a second, the state is actually trying to implement its human rights obligations here. That would be interesting, but it's not happening at all. Maybe I'll leave my comments there. Others will have interesting things to say.
Great. Thank you, Leilani. So, other panelists want to jump in on any of the 4 comments or questions that you heard?
I may.
Guadalupe wants
Yeah.
to take a crack at it.
Sure. Okay, so I'm going just to pick some ideas. First of all, regarding investment, what we're discussing here, and I think it's important to keep the focus, is not whether housing has become a safe risk investment for individual landowners or property owners. I mean, I came from Argentina. We are used to cyclists, to crisis, regular crisis, economic crisis. So housing has actually become a safe risk investment and actually means of life. So we are not discussing that. What we are discussing is corporative owners, the massive property purchase that is being done in cities through cooperative and big multinational firms, not the individual who is looking for or who maybe inherited a property and is using that just to complete his salary. That is not the discussion, so that is not the focus. And regarding that there is no other alternative of investment, I would say there is plenty of alternative of investment. None is so profitable as housing, and that is the problem. That is what we are facing. And that is basically at the roots of the discussion we are having about why housing is financialized. And moving on to some of the remedies regarding the social housing, I mean, that is a very interesting perspective. Argentina, I know I have been very tough on my own government this morning, but I might recognize that a few weeks ago it was implemented a social access to credit that does not involve formal labor conditions. So that is a huge step because they are recognizing that informality, spatial and housing informality is related to informal workers, so that you might be a subject of credit even if you do not have like a formal regular job. So there are some measures in that way that are being good taken care of. And I would say about the scale of the discussion, I don't know, I don't think that the discussion is to choose whether this is an international or local issue. It's complex, though we have to see all the scales at the time. I mean, we do have to have our international right humans framework, and we do have it actually, and most of our governments do agree with that and commit with that. We have to have a local discussion based on how to allocate resources to solve the housing problem and the deficit, but we do have also to have a national discussion, especially in countries such as Argentina, Brazil, or Mexico and Latin America, that are federal countries, because without a national urban policy, the housing actions remain very fragmented and do not promote like an equal territorial action. So I know it's difficult, but I think we do have to attend all these levels of discussion regarding housing, from the local to the international level. It's not a matter of choosing which one to attend first.
Okay, thank you, Guadalupe. Do you want to say something?
Yes, I think I'd like to respond to Amin. No, I agree that it's hard to prevent or prohibit private investments in housing, whether it's for the purpose of living or for the purpose of creating wealth. But there's still so much government can do, especially in some of our countries where millions of people are simply kept from adequate housing. For instance, in many of the big investments, corporate investments in housing, it is possible for governments to insist that these investors actually allocate percentages of their investment to build affordable housing. But it's a situation where a government official sits in a department and approves the construction of, thousands, 50,000 housing units that are priced beyond even some of the people in the super middle class. That's insane. So when you have that, then clearly that government is not, being attentive to its human rights obligations to protect people and to ensure that people actually have access. But I think that ultimately, housing is fundamentally a place to live, because even those who invest in other environments live somewhere. And when access to housing becomes difficult, people will find a place to live, even if that place is a slum. And that's why you have slums growing in many countries exponentially, why the concentration of urban population is growing, but the production of housing stock is in retreat. But I think finally that the solution to the problem, it's not just because when we think housing, then it becomes more difficult. But from where I come from, when you think land, it's a lot easier to understand because people already live somewhere. The problem is that they do not have the legal security of tenure to stay where they are, and therefore don't have any incentive to build their own housing. I mean, no one really expects governments to go around building housing for people to live. I think it's really about creating the necessary conditions that will incentivize individuals to invest. But who will invest in a house, even if you have the money, when you're not sure that house will stand tomorrow? So I think that you can solve a lot of problems by just simply taking a very cost-effective approach to re-engineer housing policy, land policy, in a way that actually gives people the incentive to do it for themselves.
Thank you, Felix. Anthony, did you want to add anything?
Just a small comment from, just to react to Egypt's comment. I think this is a very valid point about middle-class investors and the asset classes that are available to them. Certainly, if you're in an economy, in a country that has a tumultuous political environment, real estate is a pretty secure investment. And I think this is, for middle-class investors, it's not so much about profitability, it's about security. It's a store of wealth. Can you put your money into something that 10 years from now, 20 years from now is still going to be worth something, regardless of devaluations of currencies or revolutions or what have you? Land is always worth something. And so it's about security investment, not profitability. For middle-class investors, the question is do they have any other asset classes available to them? If you look in some other countries, many middle-class investors, most of their investments are tied up in government bonds or equities in the market, but in some countries it's not the case. Even in very wealthy countries, if you look at Germany, most Germans own a home, but most Germans do not own the home they live in. Think about that. And that is a product of policy. You have a fiscal incentive, you get a tax incentive if you buy a house as an investment. You do not get a tax incentive if you buy a house that you live in. So everybody owns their neighbor's house. It's a bit strange, but that's the way it is. The other thing I wanted to react to is this issue about public housing. Public housing can very easily be caricatured as really bad, gloomy, government-owned thing for poor people that's some sort of gray communist-era block that falls apart over time and then eventually catches fire. There are shades of gray in how you manage these things. We heard about Singapore's public housing. Public housing in Singapore is not a free thing that you just walk into. You still have to buy it. There is a partial ownership. But ownership is not sort of a carte blanche. It's mine now. I can do whatever I want with it. There are certain property rights assigned to it. You own it. It will appreciate in value over time, but by a controlled amount. It can be sold, but it can only be sold to another Singaporean. It can't be sold to a foreigner or anything like that. We heard earlier about price controls on flipping houses in this report. There's all kinds of shades of gray you can do to kind of provide controls. The other aspect of public housing or a public policy on housing is rent control. So the government doesn't own the housing, but they can still control rents. The town you're in right now, every single apartment in this town is subject to rent control. Every one of them. All of the middle class people in this town have rent control. All of the upper class people in this town have rent control. That is just the Swiss policy because it's a very small country and they don't have a lot of place to live, so they have to control these things. So just to say that public housing is not this kind of binary one thing where you build a very gray Stalinist block. There are lots of policy options within that space.
Thank you, Anthony. That's great. Now we still have time for a second round of comments, questions from the audience. I would ask you to try to keep them a little shorter. Let's see. Do I see an emerging hand here in the middle?
Hello. Thank you very much for this. It's fascinating. I'm Mika. I'm with the Who Profits Research Center. So we do work on the Israeli occupation economy. And so just kind of to expand the complicated conversation in kind of different contexts, one of the things that we see when we look at land grab in the occupied territories, that actually for the Israeli state, Palestinian land becomes the most easily available land because they can, using military orders, can confiscate it and then make it into state land that is then for the government an easy solution for an existing housing crisis within its own population. And then you see tenders for different kinds of housing projects built in accordance with outline plans that actually refer to Palestinian land owned by specific communities, sometimes privately owned land. And I don't really, there isn't a specific question so much as just kind of adding to the conversation. How do you talk about housing under a situation of occupation, and then how does that interact with international law as well, not just kind of human rights law?
Great, thank you. And I think we have a woman over here.
Hi, my name is Penelope Simonson. I'm an associate professor at the University of Ottawa in Canada. I probably didn't have to add Canada. Most people know where Ottawa is. So sometimes when you go some places, people don't know. That is the Canada. So I just wanted to touch on this issue of international investment agreements and also the location about where to talk about this issue. I think international investment agreements, I started working on that about almost over 10 years ago, maybe 15 years ago, this issue of the implication of international investment agreements for human rights. And at that time, nobody recognized that really that there was, or very few people, that there was a human rights implication, or there were human rights implications of international investment agreements in terms of the constriction of policy and other things, the sort of unbalanced aspect of them. But I think now there is quite widespread recognition, in UNCTAD, among even more sort of typical international investment scholars and governments. And so I think there is a space now to start advocating for human rights obligations of investors, and also certain mechanisms to redress the imbalance of those agreements. The second thing is in terms of this treaty on business and human rights. I think this is an issue of business and human rights, and so I think the right to housing should be discussed within that context. For whatever treaty we get, it's clearly in the early stages and a very contested process. But there's also national action plans that are being developed by states right now under the guiding principles on business and human rights. And so perhaps locating a discussion on the financialization of housing there would be useful. So discussions with the working group on business and human rights about it.
Great, thank you for those constructive ideas. Is there one more comment from the audience before I turn it back to the panel? If not, then, okay, we have our final question or comment here.
Hi, Ruth Gallagher from the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission. And in Ireland, we're in the middle of a massive housing crisis at the moment. So my question for the panel is, what can national human rights institutions usefully do around this issue? I think Leilani sort of touched on it earlier by saying that most states and governments really only want to talk about evictions and homelessness, but they don't really want to frame this issue in the right to housing space. So is there any useful advice that you'd offer to an NHRI?
Great. Okay, so I'm going to turn it back to our panelists. Anthony, I'm still here. You have to leave early, so I'm going to turn it over to you first. And I would just ask you to use the last minute that you have to either answer something or sum up by whatever way you want to.
Thank you very much. Sorry, in my notes it says session ends 9:15 sharp. So,
that was just to make you guys go quicker.
Yeah, I think it's a compliment to the organizers and to the topic and to all of you that there's so much vibrant discussion about this and that we're talking about this. I find it very interesting. It's the first time I've participated in this kind of topic. One thing I would say is it was mentioned earlier that we shouldn't underestimate the amount of ignorance in this space. I think that's a very valid point. So if we talk about things that I could take away from this, what can be done, is the need to create more awareness within economic investment policy circles around housing and as a human right. I like the mention of the phrasing around talking about people's homes and sort of separating housing from other asset classes. And this is, I think there's lessons to be learned here from what conversations that took place a couple of years ago around food. Food is also treated by some people as an asset class, but food is a human right too. So I think there are things here, even water, access to water issues, which is often sometimes looked at as a commodity, but is also a human right. So to me, that's a big takeaway, that there can be more to raise awareness within investment policy circles, economic policy circles around these issues.
Beautiful. And I love the closing by way of a takeaway. So let's see. Felix, can I ask you to close also in just a minute or a minute and a half?
I think what I would say in closing is that this is a dire topic of immense importance to so many people. As we speak at this moment in Lagos, more than 10,000 families are marked to be evicted to pave way for all kinds of housing development around them that they can never afford. Minimum wage in Nigeria is still 18,000 naira, which is less than $41 a month. And a lot of the housing projects that are springing up everywhere, none of them is priced less than 40 million naira. And this is money you have to pay upfront. It's not money that you can finance, because finance is unavailable. So this is a crisis of unbelievable proportion. So I think we can have this conversation for a long time. But my point here is that it's about people, and ultimately they are the ones who will change policy. They're the ones who will insist that their governments respect their rights. And the good news is that in many cases, in my experience, where people have actually said, yes, we're citizens, we're people recognized under the law who have a right to live in peace and security and in dignity. Somehow, even with some of the most vicious dictatorships we've had in Nigeria, they have managed to exercise the right to remain, and they have remained. So ultimately, yes, it's really about the local circumstances, about the people and what they do to take back that power that actually belongs to them, ultimately.
Great. Thank you, Felix. Guadalupe, closing in a minute or a minute and a half?
Yep. Okay, before my closing thoughts, just a brief comment on the militarization of land, that I don't know if Palestinian case is literally to be treated as what we have been discussing now, but I do want to emphasize the bonds between the military forces, the governments, and the political power, the economical power. So this is a huge other topic we haven't gone through, but I do believe it's very important, the role of the military forces. What I would like to close as a final thought is to, I think Anthony may have tried to imply this. What we are discussing here is that every right entails obligations and benefits. The thing is, what we see, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that in the last decades, the whole unregulated market, what is proposing is to actually have benefits and do not comply with our obligations. So what we are discussing, as we mentioned it before, is not the small individual that is actually thinking of housing as a security value, but how the corporative impact in housing markets is proposing that owners are only taking their benefits and not actually compromising with the obligations they have. And this is what we call the social function of property, that is in most of our constitutions, but we are not accomplishing this basic right, that is, the property has a social function, and it implies that you have limits to the right of being an owner. We do not have to say that housing is a human right to actually struggle for this, even though it's very important to have an international law saying that housing is a human right. What we are talking here is about a basic need to live. There is no possibility to survive as a human being. And yes, you can construct a house, you can occupy a land and build your own house, but the housing issue is a state matter, and it should be taken into account by governments, because what we're ultimately discussing is what are our rights as a society and our collective, not individual rights. So I do encourage, this is not about tearing down capitalism, even though I might like to, but it's not about that. But so far, private corporate investors haven't shown much commitment to the housing, to the right of housing. So far, this has been the case, at least in Latin America. So I do encourage all of us as a collective, in terms of private sector, public sector, academics, social, civil organizations, to have an open dialogue, a sincere dialogue that should be on the base that we have to accomplish this as a human right. And that means assuming that we do have benefits and we do have obligations.
Thank you, Guadalupe. Okay, Leilani.
I don't have a lot of time here. I want to underscore what Guadalupe just said. You know, I'm the rapporteur on the right to housing, and I'm therefore dealing with human rights. And one of the things I love about human rights is it's very clear who is responsible to whom. And it's states that are responsible to the people and to most vulnerable populations. So what I would argue is that the main responsibility right now on this issue is for states to ensure that all investment in housing recognizes housing's social function and that recognizes states' human rights obligations. So I don't care how they do it. Figure it out. That is the role of states. You have human rights obligations, and you have investors that are making it difficult for you as a state to meet your human rights obligations. So figure it out. What are you going to do to make sure the investors don't compromise your ability as a state to meet human rights obligations? So I actually don't want to tear down capitalism. I don't. I think capitalism can respond to human rights. I think there can be a very nice and symbiotic relationship between capitalism and human rights. We just have to figure out that equation. On the issue of international human rights law and its validity and, you know, do we need another treaty? Well, you know what? Another treaty is being negotiated. And so, is it fine to just sit back and let it happen and not insert the right to housing where it belongs? We can't, right? We have to insert it. Will it be effective unto itself? No. It's what happens to it when it hits the ground. One, it has to hit the ground. Local people have to use it, and when they use it, then it breathes life into the instrument. I go to so many countries, meet so many people, and it is very meaningful for them to know there is an international treaty that says that everyone has the right to adequate housing. I mean, it really is incredibly meaningful. And lastly, I'll say this. One of the things I'm trying to do is obviously promote these sorts of discussions. And I've boldly, some people have said, and maybe foolishly others might say, decided to try to launch a new global movement that's called The Shift. And the aim of it is to be multi-stakeholder, so all actors. And the aim of it is to reclaim the right to adequate housing, or to give the right to adequate housing more energy and more life in international and domestic discourses and activities. So I ask you to continue to follow me or begin to follow me on Twitter and Facebook, and you will start seeing updates about The Shift and how you might participate in The Shift. And I'm going to leave it there. Oh, no, I'm not going to leave it there. I need to thank our incredible moderator who kept us to the time. I made us late. Thank you. And thanks to all of you.
Great. Thank you, Leilani. Thanks, everyone. I think that was a really great beginning of a conversation that we need to have more of at the forum. And thanks to all of you for taking part. Thank you.
Yes.
You around?
Are we late? Thank you.
You were great. But can I have his presentation? Not this.
Yeah, because
you sent it?
No, I sent it to Juana, but I'm going to put some more links because it's full of links.
That's good.
So just to digital books and films.
We need to be working with you. Your work is really good.
We should.
Really, really good.
We should.
Yeah.
We should. Yeah.
Figure out. We need to move this What you said in response to me.
I don't know if I was because I am not normally very diplomatic, so it's a problem, and I tend not to be very diplomatic, but it was my good luck.
Not at all, mine too. I'm like, the way you answered was perfect. It was diplomatic.
Right panel. It was excellent.
They were so nice.
And the floor and the room. I was in the wrong room.
Oh,
I bet you got to go back to that room.
that's right. They switched rooms on us. That's right.
No, thank you.
I know our office, my colleagues in your office as well.
Oh, good.
Yeah,
Oh, that's right.
Yes,
That's right.
And I'm just wondering whether you have a printed one. They have it at Forum next February.
Kuala Lumpur. I want to introduce you to Julie. This is my friend. She is going to the work that I am not. Yeah, so you might, do you want to give her, oh, you don't have a card, but I'll give you a, but she will convey everything to me, so I unfortunately just can't make it.